From Germaine de Randamie running away from actual fighters, to Ronda Rousey being exposed by Holly Holm, these are some of the worst female UFC fighters of all time. There's the one, and thankfully only, Germaine de Randamie, the first UFC Women's Featherweight Champion. Now don't get me wrong, she had her 15 seconds of fame after defeating the legendary Holly Holm at UFC 208 to claim the title. But after winning that shiny belt, what does Germaine do? She vacates it. Yeah, you heard that right. She handed the belt back as if she'd never earned it in the first place. And the worst part is, she did it because she was scared of fighting Cris Cyborg. Talk about ducking and diving. I get it. I wouldn't want to get in a cage with Cyborg either, but come on. You're supposed to be the champ. If you thought that was bad, well, it gets worse because after pulling the chicken act of the century, Germaine decided to make a move back down to bantamweight, and guess who was waiting for her? Amanda freaking Nunes, the reigning bantamweight queen of all people. Talk about getting out of the frying pan and into the fiery pits of hell itself. And spoiler alert, it didn't end well for our girl Germaine. Nunes showed Germaine who the boss really was at UFC 245, finishing the fight before it even began. Nunes showed Germaine how a real champ deals with their responsibilities, and it's safe to say that her reign as a champ was, well, short-lived and far from extraordinary. Moving on to the flyweight division, we've got the first ever champ in that category, Nico Montaño. She burst onto the UFC scene after winning the Ultimate Fighter, a new world champion season, showing off some serious star power. Her control of the octagon was tighter than your grandma's grip on her purse during a Black Friday sale, and her striking game flowed smoother than any criminal I've heard of. It was a sight to behold, to say the least, but you can already guess how her story ends if she's in this video. After winning the championship, Nico never actually defended her belt, not even once. The UFC stripped her of her title after she ended up in the hospital due to a weight cut gone wrong for her scheduled fight at UFC 228. But Nico wasn't ready to throw in the towel just yet. She made her comeback fight at bantamweight against Juliana Pena, and everyone was looking forward to seeing a triumphant return, like a phoenix rising from the ashes. But sadly, it wasn't meant to be, as Nico ended up tasting defeat in that fight, which was just the first in a series of unfortunate events. Fight cancellations? Check. Weight cut issues? Double check. It looked like Nico couldn't catch a break, and the UFC thought the same, who felt that it was time to part ways with her in 2021. Moving on though, here's a double feature for you. Namajunas and Carla Esparza, who put on the undisputed worst fight in UFC history. Hold on to your reclining seats and weighted blankets because I'm going to be diving into the snooze fest of the century. I mean, seriously, this fight was like a cure for insomnia, so dull that I'm surprised the audience didn't start counting sheep instead of cheering. It was the ultimate game of chicken, with both fighters hesitating to throw punches while the audience was waiting for some explosive action. It felt like watching a ballet performance, but instead of graceful leaps and twirls, there were just two washed-up fighters tiptoeing around each other, almost like it was a dance-off where nobody remembered the choreography. And let's not forget what happened when the final bell rung, as Carla ended up winning the fight, snatching the UFC Strawweight Championship with a split decision. But guess what? Rose didn't agree with the judge's call, arguing that she'd landed more hits than Carla. Yeah, maybe instead of complaining, she could have tried, doing something during the fight. And if you thought that was the end of it, prepare to be even more disappointed, because following the fight, Rose simply disappeared from the spotlight. She had no significant matches or any attempts to reclaim the title, just a vanishing act that honestly didn't surprise anyone who saw her performance that night. When it comes to controversial fights in the female division, though, there's also another fighter who's at the center of much debate: Juliana Pena. Pena's victory in her title fight against Nunes was considered by most to be nothing more than a fluke, and for good reason. She doesn't really know how to fight. Most of her punches are as wild as a kangaroo on a sugar rush, and she charges in without a second thought. She's the embodiment of a real-life button masher in the UFC. But hey, who am I to judge, right? I'll leave that to the champ herself, Nunes, who called Pena's win lucky though. Let's be real, that was probably just her being polite. Nobody wants to be a sore loser, but I'm sure that deep down we all know what was really going on. Nunes had not only been plagued by a knee injury but was also recovering from COVID, so she was far from being at peak performance. That much was obvious when the much-anticipated rematch rolled around, and boy did it paint a clear picture for all to see, with Nunes showing everyone why she's the superior fighter, even snagging a unanimous decision victory to leave no room for doubt. It's pretty hard to argue with that kind of results, and Nunes proved that the version that we'd seen of her in their last bout was not the person who was holding the title that night. Let's take a break from digging up older fighters and instead talk about a stinker that's fighting in the UFC in the present, Ashley Yoder. When it comes to records, Yoder's, well, not exactly one to brag about. At the time of making this video, she's sitting at 3 wins and a whopping 7 losses. And to add a dash of salt to the wound, she's currently on a 2-loss streak as well. I mean, we all have our ups and downs, but 7 losses? Someone get this girl her participation trophy. Let's rewind a bit and talk about Yoder's UFC debut, which didn't exactly go as planned, as she faced off against Justine Kish and ended up losing via unanimous decision. Don't you worry though, that was just the beginning of a series of unanimous decision losses on her record, a total of 5 to be exact. I'd make a joke about the judges never being on her side, but having seen some of her fights, I don't think I'd score in her favor either. Now, when it comes to Yoder's skills, well, let's just say she's not exactly known for her striking or wrestling prowess. She's had a tough time finding her groove and continues to do so, which is evident in her fights. Plus, most of Yoder's wins have also come against opponents who, let's say, have the same level of recognition in the octagon. Can't really pat yourself on the back for winning against nobodies, can you? So a win might be a win, but I'd argue that it doesn't really count in this case. To wrap things up though, there's no way I can't mention one of the biggest names in MMA history, Ronda Rousey. Grab your popcorn because this is going to be a fun one. Let's address the elephant in the room, folks. Some people say Ronda's popularity skyrocketed because there weren't any legit female fighters in the UFC at that time, almost like she was like a shiny rock in a sea of gravel. Don't get me wrong, Ronda had skills, but the competition just wasn't as fierce as it is today, which was evident in her fight against Holly Holm. I don't think I can say anything about the fight that hasn't already been said. It was like watching David slaying Goliath. Except in this case, Goliath was Ronda, and David was Holly, armed with nothing but pure, raw, unfiltered knockout power. Ronda's skills were exposed in that fight, and Holly showed her that was no longer the top dog in the division, and that it takes more than just grappling with physically weaker opponents to be a champ. Don't get me wrong, Ronda's grappling game was good, but it was nothing compared to Holly's striking skills and footwork. Still, I can't deny the impact that Ronda had on women's MMA, pretty much being one of the main reasons it exists in the first place, and also inspiring countless young fighters to step into the cage. For that, I gotta give credit where credit is due. So from Ronda Rousey's lack of skills being exposed by Holly Holm to Germaine de Randamie running away from actual fighters, these were some of the worst female UFC fighters of all time.